This week, we welcome back Dan DeCloss, founder and CTO at PlexTrac, to discuss facing the reality of risk prioritization. Then we'll be joined by Bianca Lewis, CEO at Girls Who Hack and Secure Open Vote, to give us an update on DEF CON Kids. In the security news, mouse jacking still works. CISA recommends a complete rebuild. Memory safety and rewriting code. Not all doorbells are created equal. Putting a firewall in front of your LLM. Rugged gear and vulnerabilities. PLCs are not safe. Neither are Windows kernels. And code is malware if you cannot verify the source. All that and more on this episode of Paul's Security Weekly. This is a Security Weekly production for security professionals by security professionals. Please visit securityweekly.com/subscribe to subscribe to all the shows on our network. It's the show where exploits run wild, packets aren't the only things getting sniffed, and the cocktails flow steady. It's Paul's Security Weekly. In the ever-present threat of cyber attacks, even a simple wrong click can spell disaster. ThreatLocker built endpoint protection so you can operate a zero-trust security posture built on a default deny. ThreatLocker allows you to control what runs and what those applications can do, access, and how they interact. Don't let your trusted applications be used against you. For comprehensive protection against evolving threats, turn to ThreatLocker Cyber Heroes at securityweekly.com/ThreatLocker. Identity is at the core of every great digital experience. Ping Identity solutions support the scale, flexibility, and resiliency required by enterprise-level IT teams for lasting digital transformation. With 99.99% uptime and over 3 billion identities under management, they're the only identity vendor that's proven to champion the scale, performance, and security of large enterprises. That's why Ping Identity champions your unique identity needs. They give you the tools to offer your users the right access at the right times, no matter how they connect with you. Visit securityweekly.com/Ping Identity to learn more. Coming to you, not broadcasting live in super low definition from G-Unit Studios for now, compliments of Darth Vader himself. This is Paul's Security Weekly, episode number 819, being recorded on March 6th, 2024. Mandy Logan, welcome to the show.
Well, hi, thank you. Thank you, Paul. I'm really excited about Dan being here, and I would say in very extremely low-tech news today, I made somebody bleed at a driving range.
Regular golf, I could see that. Driving range is a story, perhaps, maybe for the next segment.
Well, actually, he laughed so hard at something I said that he fell off his walker.
Good Lord.
And he's a recent amputee and is just getting used to having a new fake leg.
Wow.
So, yeah.
Sounds like you had quite the day. Quite the day.
Exactly.
Well, it's good to have you. We'll be joined by some other co-hosts for the next segment. And usually when we're this light, it means there's a conference happening somewhere. I think this week it's FSISAC. Man, that might have been last week, but they're at a conference somewhere. Quick announcement, Security Weekly listeners save $100 on their RSA Conference 2024 Full Conference Pass. RSA will take place on May 6th through the 9th in San Francisco and on demand. To register using the discount code, please visit securityweekly.com/RSAC24 and use the code 54USSecWeekly. Hope to see you there. I won't be there, but other people will be. Make sure you subscribe to the Below the Surface podcast by Eclipsium in partnership with CRA. Myself and co-host Alan Alford are excited to bring you an entire new season of exciting episodes. You can find us at eclipsium.com/podcast. Dan DeCloss is the founder and CTO of PlexTrac, has over 17 years of experience in cybersecurity, started his career in the Department of Defense, and then moved on to the private sector where he worked for various companies. He has a background in application security and penetration testing, and was the director of cybersecurity for Sensi, I think I'm saying that right, where he and his team built the security program out of its infancy into a best-in-class program. Dan has a passion for helping everyone understand cybersecurity at a practical level, ensuring that focus is on the right work to reduce risk. Dan, welcome to the show. Welcome back, I should say.
Hey, thanks. Yeah, thank you. Always good to be here, and thanks for having me back. I've been looking forward to it.
Yes, me too, Dan. It's always nice to talk with you. It's interesting in reading your bio and having built a security program from the ground up. I too kind of share that in my career path as well when I worked for the university and built a security program from the ground up. And I think one thing that we're going to talk about today has a commonality in when you build a security program from the ground up that is still a challenging thing today, and that is prioritization. And you and I have talked at length about prioritization in various contexts, but certainly, whether you're starting from scratch or you have a really mature program, you still have this challenge of how do I prioritize what I need to fix, what I need to build, and what I need to do in my security program?
Yeah, no, exactly. And I think that, when we talk about, all the limitations that you have in terms of time, money,
Hmm.
people, you always want to make sure like, hey, am I working on the right things to get the biggest bang for my buck? We have like all these limitations on us. So like we want to make sure like, hey, we're working on the right things that are going to actually have the biggest impact. And that's no easy task, regardless of how many tools and how much automation you have, and all the other the aspects that go into investments in a security team and security program. At the end of the day, you still got to focus on like, hey, are we working on the right things? Can we show that we're making progress? And can we show that our security posture is improving over time? All very challenging questions, but really the root of what you really want to answer, right? So,
And it's interesting too, Dan, and I've spent some time recently thinking about this more, and that is how to give something a score, right? How to give it a number, a rating that indicates the severity of that. Let's talk about vulnerabilities first, right?
right.
And you've done some work on this recently too. What are your thoughts on like introducing how we think about scoring?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think that for the longest time we've got products out there that have had like kind of like your risk score and things like that, or tried to standardize risk scoring. And I don't think those are necessarily bad approaches, and still a good concept. But at the end of the day, even like when we were running our own security program, and I'm sure you kind of came across it as like, hey, a vulnerability scanner may tell you that something's a critical vulnerability, or you may get a third party risk assessment where they're just saying, hey, from the external view, you have this kind of risk score, but it doesn't allow you to put the context of your business into what you are trying to prioritize, right? So a critical vulnerability coming in from a vulnerability scan is going to be the same criticality regardless of where it's placed in your network or what compensating controls exist around it. So being able to provide the context for your business is super important, right? And actually a problem that a lot of people have tried to solve. And like we've even talked to people where it's like, oh man, we tried to do this internally 5 years ago or whatever, and still just kind of rely on spreadsheets and stuff.
Mm.
Uh, so yeah, it is a challenge for the industry, and we're excited to be able to be bringing that capability to the market as well.
Absolutely. And I've been picking on scoring recently, for a lot of reasons. I have an upcoming conference talk on it, and there's lots of these little scenarios that we've run through and events that have happened, particularly in the past year, that like really got me thinking about scoring, and particularly getting right down to it. How does an organization go, should I fix that, and where in the priority does it fall when we're talking about some kind of vulnerability that has been publicized, or maybe not so much publicized, right? How do we
Yeah.
how do we do that? And so when we look to, and look, I don't want to. I was talking about this actually on the Eclipsium podcast, that I don't want to pick on people or things or companies, because I don't think
Right.
that's productive, right? So
Yep.
I don't want to pick on MITRE and CVE, and I don't want to pick on NVD, but I want to address things that I think are problems that I don't agree with, and I'm more than happy to be part of the solution. In fact, it's really funny, Dan. Right as I had completed my CFP. I'm grateful that it had been accepted to talk at B-Sides Charm. It was basically talking about all these issues with CVE and CVSS. And then I went to the NVD's website, and it's like, hey, we're working on things, so our service may not be, available. And turns out like there's people that are forming working groups, I'm told, that will be helping this program. I'm like, it's good. I want to be part of it, right? I want to be part of the solution as much as now I'm going to be part of the problem and talking about the problems. But I want to be part of the solution, right?
Yeah.
And there's all these weird edge cases that are like, well, let's start with the one that I think really shines, highlights pen testing and pen test reporting. And that is, I didn't know that there was a vulnerability there because it never got a CVE. So I didn't score it. It wasn't scored by anyone, right? And there was no CVE, but the vendor just kind of silently fixed something. So now I look at applying the patch and I go, there's no security problems here. So now I do my risk equation and I go, well, I'm going to wait. Like what? Operational risk is a thing. I'm going to wait. But where I think the value is in pen testing and your platform, Dan, is to start incorporating some of that information, right? Get that data that comes from a hands-on person into that decision matrix, right?
Yeah, exactly. And so like if you think about like something that's found in a penetration test where they may be putting their own score on it when they're doing the assessment for you, because like that's
Sure.
obviously common, but at the same rate, they still may not have all the context that you want to support, in terms of like, okay, well, we've got 10 of these across, 30 apps. How do we distinguish which one we should work on first? It's not a matter of the fact that we're going to get to it. It's just like, what's the order of priority? And so what we've been able to supply is a way to actually have an objective view of that through our contextual scoring service. So it comes out of the box of like, hey, here's the weighting criteria that you might want to apply, and then you can change that. So an example I like to give, because I know Jeff Mann's not on our session today, but like I've had good conversations with him in the past. So PCI is always a big topic, right, on this show. And but when you talk about, hey, not only was this pen test done and the pen tester didn't have a CVE associated with it, but he or she found it, and then was able to exploit it, and they provided their own score to it. But now we can also say like, okay, well, based on our scoring algorithm, we're prioritizing items, assets, or findings that are associated with the CDE. And so now we have a score assigned to those findings and risks that can now show you, okay, this is the criteria of how it's getting weighted. It's now objective, and it's within the context of your business. And I think that's what's kind of been missing, and as we've done a lot of research in customer validation around this, it's been very important for folks in terms of, I have all this data. I have pen test data. I have VulnScan data. Anything proactive in terms of assessments, it's coming in. It's almost too much to know really how to prioritize it. So now you can assign your own criteria to that, and it can take into context the other scoring mechanisms from other sources, right? So like say CVSS still can be a factor in that, but It doesn't have to be the only factor. And I think that's a critical. I think that's an important distinction, right?
Agreed, Mandy.
Well, he kind of ended up answering my question. I was curious, does the contextual scoring vary based on the client or the customer that's using the PlexTrac system?
Yeah, so that's the beauty of it, right? Is that within PlexTrac, you can segment by clients if you're like a service provider, so you can service your clients, or if it's an enterprise, you can segment it by business units or whatnot. So what we were able to do with this contextual scoring piece is be able to apply it either to an individual client or for the entire tenant, right? So the entire organization. So that way it provides that flexibility. Even like within a large enterprise, you may have different business units or different, office locations or different subnets, however you're structuring the data, where you may want to have one algorithm assigned to a specific business unit and then one to a different one, and you can do that with our system. So, being able to actually provide different criteria for different organizations, clients, et cetera.
So then is the contextual scoring, both on the PlexTrac side, is it modified and updated basically real time based on what's going on in the industry? Or is once it's set and you have a client that is using it, the way that the scoring is done stays static?
Yeah, no, good question. So the algorithm itself stays static, but you can change it at any point in time. Right. So as you grow and adapt, you may start saying like, actually, some new criteria is popping up. Like, hey, we want to keep adding to the algorithm. You can adapt it over time, and that automatically will update the score of the findings themselves. Right. So anytime something changes in the system, the score will change according to the algorithm, but the algorithm is static unless you want to change it, right? So that's kind of how it works, if that makes sense.
I just want to harp on that for a moment because I think that's super important because things change, not just in your own environment, but outside your environment as well. And maybe you have a team that tracks it closely. Maybe you have partnerships, products that help inform you to make these decisions. But covering vulnerabilities on the podcast for 18 plus years, right? I've witnessed several instances where we believe at this point in time that it's this severity, that an exploit exists or doesn't exist, or is this effective or this level of difficulty. But then as time goes on, new information, new exploits, new techniques come out that change your score. So Dan, when you said you can change it, I think that's super important because also you're providing a facility for us to track this, right? Because my question is always like, how are we tracking, okay, this particular vulnerability, if it's in our environment, carries this, risk score, but then that changes. Now I got to go back and I got to change that. And that then should be communicated to the whole team in a new process, or new process should be triggered, right, to deal with that, right?
Right. Yeah, exactly. And so the way that the score is calculated is important to kind of stay consistent. But as data within the system changes, that will update the score of its individual component, right? So like if I have a finding that all of a sudden, hey, some new information comes out and I need to, elevate this to a critical or whatnot, like that, all that criteria can be applied, and the algorithm itself will then say like, okay, now this is like a 70 as opposed to a 50, right? Something like that. And that's important because things do change, and then over time you may start to be managing your data differently, right? So say like you're a large organization and you acquire another company and they have a whole different way of categorizing their assets or something like that. That may now affect how you want to score your algorithms, right? And so you can add that kind of criteria to your algorithm. So it really gives you the flexibility while trying to stay objective within the context of your business. And I think that's a critical piece
And I like that in the other direction, Dan, right? We tend, like as practitioners, I think we tend to harp on things that we need to go fix. And we sometimes don't like to think that stuff like, I'm going to use Spectre and Meltdown as an example. From what I've learned over time and talking with people and researching it, that would be one where I would go, you know what, that's a lower priority for me, right? Yeah. Not the entire bug class necessarily, because I think Zenbleed is super bad and you should go fix that. Because then I tested it and I was like, well, if that existed in my environment, which it did exist in my personal environment, and it was fixed, I'm like, well, thank God, like that's good. But like Spectre and Meltdown, I'm like, okay, I would lower that, right? Because no new information has come out that really should make me want to go react to that. So I want to save cycles in doing other things.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. And that's where we're headed to with this product, is being able to also start incorporating threat intelligence into it, right? So that can play a factor of like, hey, if this has zero like exploitability in the wild and nobody is actually conducting exploits, maybe it should be a lower priority than some of these vulnerabilities that you have that are being exploited in the wild. You've got, this is the nice thing about correlating like threat intelligence with pen test data, is there may not be any kind of TTP or IOC assigned to it, but the same type of technique can be correlated, and then it's saying like, okay, this is happening in the wild. This has been done in your environment. You should definitely prioritize this really high.
I like this in the context of it's not mechanical, right? And I've seen a lot of organizations go, we're going to use CVSS, and if it's a CVSS of 7 or higher, it gets this level priority. And there's a lot, as we already pointed out, there's a lot of other factors that are just like, so my thing with Spectre and Meltdown was my enhanced Paul's threat intelligence is I go ask my friends, right? So over the course of a couple of weeks, as I'm conversing with my friends in cybersecurity, I'm like, is Spectre and Meltdown, have we seen anyone exploit that? Do you know of, you don't have to tell me specifics, but like, do you know, like I'm trying to judge the expression on their face, right? Like, do you know of this being exploited in the wild? And like, I come away from that, coupled with my own research, coupled with the CVSS data, pen test data. I'm like, okay, here's how I think we deal with this today, right? That could change, but today, that's like my unscientific way. But you're providing a facility for organizations to track that, which I think is valuable.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. So, I mean, like, not only do you get the score, I mean, yeah, everybody's going to have a kind of like, oh, hey, these are our top 10, and you can be, you could be working on all of them, but like, you can say like, hey, here's who's assigned to these, and here's the status of them. And I think that's another important piece, as we talk about like security program management is, at the end of the day, somebody's just got to be doing the work, right? We've identified all the issues. We've actually even provided a mechanism to give you a prioritized list of things to work on. Now we need to actually be reporting on, like, is this stuff getting done? And then are we making progress? And when you talk about kind of the landscape that we live in today, where, when we first started, you're just trying to convince people to get security in some fashion. Right now it's actually getting to, and we even kind of started to claim like, hey, this is going to start to become regulatory if we're not careful. And sure enough, it's becoming regulated. So security teams are going to have to start showing, hey, did we know about certain things? What did we at least make decisions on? And this provides a mechanism to do that as well.
Yeah, and I would venture to guess, Dan, that I can use the PlexTrac system to track things that are activities, not necessarily vulnerabilities, right? So, in my example of this is, what was the Spectre Ops guy that came on and talked about purple teaming, but it wasn't like for vulnerabilities, right? It was take privilege escalation, right? And then you even break that down. Like, is it from local user to administrator, and then administrator to kernel? And I think that probably depends on where your security maturity model is. So let's go a little earlier or lower in your security maturity model. Local user to admin. Think about privilege escalation. Sure, there are assigned vulnerabilities to that, but that is a technique. How am I addressing that, and where am I prioritizing it? Well, how susceptible am I to that? How do I measure that? And then track that moving forward is a whole exercise. And so I think that organizations need to think about not just vulnerabilities, but more, I like to use the word exposures. Based on these exposures, okay, I'm concerned about like local user to admin. Let's enumerate in a purple team, all the ways to do that, and then use a system to track, like, okay, where we are today, where we want to get to, and all the activities need to happen for us to get there.
Yeah, exactly. So, I mean, like, we've always had that purple team, capability. So in terms of being able to test and run procedures, that either can be, pulled from MITRE or, created on the fly. You have that capability to not only identify, hey, here's what we're testing. So if you talk about privilege escalation as a category, you can actually say, like, here's all the things that we've tested in this category. And if you want to kind of give a coverage, kind of a coverage matrix component to it based on MITRE, you can say, like, hey, of the TTPs that exist in MITRE, we've had coverage over like 30% of them, right? And that actually provides data on, have you actually tested for these things? How well are you doing in terms of like coverage as well as protection in those elements?
Yeah. You're right. Can I detect it versus can I prevent it are two different things. And we're talking about this like very narrow thing, like local to admin on Windows systems. And it's not just one thing. And I think that's where, like, historically the pen test may not have been great, like historical pen tests back in the day where, I used this one technique and I went from local to admin, and therefore, like, you have to address that privilege escalation. And what we're mature to say today is, well, what about all the different ways, and what's my coverage for those? And that's, I think,
Yeah.
a huge change and a positive thing.
Oh yeah, it's huge, and it's kind of what we kind of preach around getting to a continuous paradigm, right? Doing
Mhm.
continuous assessment, doing continuous validation, because it now shows like, hey, like we ran 100 procedures related to privilege escalation. 2 weeks ago, we had 50 of them succeed. Now we've had 30 of them succeed, right? So we're getting better, and you can actually show that, and then you can use the priorities module to actually show, hey, of those ones that succeeded, here's the progress that's being made on fixing them, right?
Mm.
And so now, we have visibility into like, are we focused on these top priorities while we're executing tests, in a continuous fashion, and that's, I think, super important. Piece of that puzzle is to make sure that it's not kind of a one-time thing. It's like we've always said, like you got to be doing this consistently, because the paradigm, or the landscape changes every day.
Yeah. And that, it is a continuous assessment model that I think you were one of the ones that came on and supported that notion, right, with your software, because we can track it. But that continuous, because not only can your systems change, right? Someone undoes something, right? We've all been there. Like, oh,
Yep.
something's broken. Let me roll back the security control and see if that makes it work, right? And then we forget to go put it back, is one thing. But also the attacker techniques change. Maybe there's a new privilege escalation, a variation on a privilege escalation. Are we accounting for that? That means, like, we're not done with that particular thing. We're going to come back to it and go, all right, well, now there's just 5 new things. How do we fare against those? Now, hopefully, some of the protections and detections you put in place catch those new things just as a byproduct, right? It doesn't always happen that way, but it's nice when it does.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, like I go back to my old school days of like doing web app pen testing, where cross-site scripting, was like super easy. I
Yeah,
mean,
yeah.
it's still probably pretty common today, but there were like a million different ways to do cross-site scripting, and so you'd reach the clients. You reach a point in the test where, like, hey, this is a global problem. You just need to go like
Mm-hmm.
solve your issues around cross-site scripting. Some people would actually take that and say, like, okay, we need to apply the right filters and mechanisms to just globally address cross-site scripting. Other people would take it and like just fix the issues that you reported, and so,
Yeah.
you come back and like for validation or retesting, and you're like, well, that's great that you fixed those ones, but I still have bypasses around those.
Yeah, if I
Those
encode it this way, if I put it in a different field over here, yeah, there's right.
exactly. So like now I mean, you haven't fixed the actual root issue, and that's and it's a similar concept in that like techniques are changing all the time. So just because you've got protection mechanisms in place for the things that you know about and have tested, things could be changing. And so if you're doing this more continuously, you have a better chance of avoiding some of those bigger breaches or exploits, right?
Also, there's this notion, there's this thing that I've kind of harped on, where vulnerabilities are reported, they aren't really vulnerabilities. And we've seen a number of different cases, and usually open source projects, right? Because the thing, and this isn't necessarily a bad thing, right? I must have all the answers, but anyone can report a CVE, right? If you're not a CNA or a CVE numbering authority, you can go to MITRE, and they'll issue you a CVE, and then really anyone can score it. Now, there's the official scoring that happens, but also like the person that found it can score it, NVD can score it, the vendor can score it, and those I've seen instances recently where those are 3 different scores, which is just amazing. But if it comes down to that, because anyone can report and score, that means there's vulnerabilities being reported that maybe aren't really vulnerabilities. They may be discovered in my environment. They may carry a really high severity rating, but they're not really a vulnerability. So being able to develop your own scores and get rid of the stuff that I think we so far focused on, like, stuff you should pay attention to. Like, you got to weed out the stuff you shouldn't pay attention to. And if these are being created with high severities that aren't really problems, you want a way in your systems to be going, nope, this is not real, right? Our team has done the research. Our threat intel feed has told us, like, this isn't the right thing that you should be paying attention to.
Yeah, exactly, and that's the beauty of something like a kind of an external scoring algorithm that you can apply to these findings, or maybe false positives, is that you can a have a good way to just like, hey, those just end up bubbling themselves to the bottom. Now, one other nice thing in PlexTrac is that we also do have the capability of just generally weeding out things that are noise, right? And that can even happen before it even gets scored, right? Which is nice. So you can set those rules manually as well. But let's say it does get through your filters or whatever whatever you want to call it, right? But like your rule set, and then then you can still use this algorithm to your contextual algorithm to kind of say like, yeah, we've got criteria that's setting that, even if it's like you've tagged the findings or tagged the assets or tagged that specific type of CVE. At the end of the day, we talk and harp on like limited time and resources, but things like that do eat up people's time that take them away from focusing on the right things. And so that's always been our mission at PlexTrac, is helping you focus on the right things and saving time then in the medium tasks or the tedious tasks that you don't want to be dealing with. So good point. Yeah.
Yeah, and it's also, you gave the web application example, which I think is probably a good example of, we may have this thing that's vulnerable, that maybe is vulnerable, maybe not, but however, like it's not really reachable in our application, right? And I've seen that a lot in, not just firmware, but web applications specifically. Like this code, it's there, but it's not used or it's not reachable. So therefore, it may have a 9.8 CVSS score, but like the probability and likelihood that an attacker is going to be able to leverage that is really, really low. And that's where being able to score yourself is really useful.
Yeah. And I've actually got an example of a converse of that, where we were doing straight up code review, right? So we didn't have any way to dynamically test the things that we were finding.
Yeah.
So it was really hard to like rate, like, is this a based on the code, here's where I see a potential path, right? And here's where I see a potential exploit, but I didn't have the ability to actually run it dynamically. This was an embedded system many years ago. It was code review. We couldn't actually be able to run it dynamically. So it's purely just all not speculation. I mean, it was like informed, risk, but like that, I distinctly remember that report where we had to kind of score those findings from the pen tester side as very low. Now I know what the client took was like, oh, they found some really good stuff, and they rated it a lot higher because they actually could validate,
right?
And
that could go either way. Integer overflow. I mean, is that a bug or is it a vulnerability? I mean, you may call it a feature, right? If it's a vulnerability, you might also call it a feature if you're an attacker, right? Which is an interesting dynamic, but. I think that was one of the cases with Carl where it's like, it's an integer overflow, but it's really just a bug. It's not a security vulnerability, right? The Linux kernel team goes through this all the time. And recently, the Linux kernel team now is their own CNA and can assign things for the Linux kernel themselves, which I think in the team that does that, the person, his name's Greg, it does an amazing job. And what's nice is we can trust that process with the Linux kernel team, because they'll tell you, like, you can use a Linux kernel or you can't. Like, it doesn't matter to us, right? We want to make sure our software is better, but we're not going to be pressured to do one thing or the other based on whether or not you're going to use it, because you're not buying it. You're using it, right? And so don't use it. That's fine, right? But they do a great job with stuff like that. But again, you want to trust that teams do that well, but you also want to take that in if you're consuming that as an enterprise and it comes through in a supply chain, that you're making informed decisions.
Yeah, exactly. And I think what's interesting about this entire conversation is like we're continuing to highlight some of the unspoken things that security teams have to deal with every day, right? Is we, in the vendor space, in the blogosphere, everything, we always kind of see and hear and talk about the breaches and the cool new exploits and, all the cool new tools that are coming out that can help identify new things, which is all great. But at the end of the day, we still have this, kind of coming back to kind of like the title of the segment is like the reality of like, how do I know I'm working on the right things? And there's a lot of work that just goes on that isn't really exposed, that I don't think people recognize how much time is getting spent on it. And so things like that, like how do I sift through all this noise of, reports coming in, vulnerabilities getting identified, and then I need to assign these out to people. So I don't want to be wasting other people's time if they're not the most important things to be working on today, right? And being able to track their progress of fixing it. Because as a security team, as soon as I assign a security vulnerability to a product team, for example, they're going to probably have some, tight restrictions around getting those resolved. So if they're not really the most important things for that team to be working on, it's a trickle down effect. So I think it's just interesting that like it's not always spoken about, but I would say most people recognize the problem that live in this, right?
And what I'd like to help with that too is the pen test results. And if it's a good pen test, it's going to tell me about something that I didn't know and help me prioritize that correctly. And usually that's in the favor of, well, this is something I really need to fix, right? I've said it on the show countless times. Like, I think without the proof that someone has exploited this and done XYZ with it, we could run under assumptions that, well, I don't think that's possible, right? Especially if it's things that you've built or you're part of the architecture team. You're like, wow, we work really hard. Like, no one would do that, and if they did do that, like we would catch them. We wouldn't be susceptible. But when a pen tester comes in and does it, like, oh, we got to fix that, right? And I like overlaying that on top of all of your other risk prioritization metrics and aspects, because I think it's one of the most important things.
Yeah, exactly. And that's obviously our roots, my roots. And so, I've always felt like pen testing has played such a critical role, and it's just more about how do you get more of that validation permeated throughout your environment, right? Because pen testing is expensive. Pen testing is, it's a valuable resource, but you can't pen test everything all the time. There's some great tools coming out that we also integrate with, right? Or not coming out, that exist now that didn't, maybe 5-10 years ago, that help automate some of that pen testing. But what's important, like that it's not going away, right? Everybody recognizes the value of pen testing. It's more, how do we make it more scalable? Because human effort, can only scale so much. So can we automate some of those other things that I think, I don't know if it's published yet, but I wrote a blog post around kind of something like, hey, things like AI and the more automation techniques that we have capable today just kind of raise the low-hanging fruit for everyone, right? Which is great, because like before, you always try to get rid of that low-hanging fruit with automation. And so that you can actually focus as a pen tester on the most critical, more complex vulnerabilities and exploits that exist. So with as technology evolves and AI is on the scene, it just raises the bar for what that low hanging fruit is, which is great, because then the pen tester can spend more time on those deep, complex exploits, addressing that kind of question you just said, oh, nobody would really be able to do that. Well, someone just did,
Right.
And so now you apply that, you've got automation, you've got all of these in a continuous fashion that now are also prioritized for you. It's just that what I call like one step closer to continuous Mecca, right?
Yeah.
Hey, in this mode now, and we can really accelerate our, the growth of our security posture and team.
Man, did you have a question, comment?
I do. Quite a few. First, I have a question about the meat space practitioners adopting the scoring through PlexTrac, but I have a statement and a story first. First, I want you to know, I love data. I love data, and I have a personal, constant interest in quantifying what generally seems to be non-quantifiable or is constantly subjective. I've done that a lot throughout life in a lot of different ways. And part of that has to do with the meat space teams. So our actual practitioners using PlexTrac. I think about when I was in construction and I specialized in risk assessment. It was on hydrology, erosion, and water safety. And what I noticed is that on inspections, while trying to assess the actual risk of something, the larger the number of practitioners and experienced people that were around, the less likely it was to have any general consensus on what the actual risk was. And I viewed it as generally it was because no single person wanted to speak up first. No person wanted to take that on and say, well, I believe this. And I found that it actually worked in my favor because I was usually the only woman out there. I could say something and it not disrupt that, but get the ball rolling on, okay, how are we going to assess this risk? So that was my experience in a completely separate industry, and I believe it's the same in cybersecurity. I'm curious, do you have any background or experience or have seen the ability for using the scoring system to help adjust the hierarchy or the actual meat space practitioners having a hard time?
I think that's a good question now, and I will say, like, this is a really new module for us, right? We launched it literally last month, but it's been like a year in the making of like research and like discussion with customers and like, so I would say the data is still kind of like left to be discovered.
Understood.
But
Right.
what I do think provides a lot of value is, and by the way, I'm happy to show it too, but I know we talk a lot about it, but like the scoring algorithm is why I think that's important, like that it's static, for at least it's not being configured on the fly. It's like, hey, you as an organization agreed that this is the criteria of how we're going to weight these things to really help prioritize our risk. We can always agree to change that, but this is the way that elements within our organization are going to be scored against. And so when you're on like those independent engagements, however they're reporting it now, I can't speak to if they can game the system or not, but but if they're reporting the same way, then the algorithm will actually just highlight like this is what the risk actually reflects. You may not like what it's saying, but based on the criteria you've provided, here's the score. And I think that's really important because it's easy for us to have bias, right? Because for whatever reason. And so being able to apply a somewhat objective score that's been agreed upon by the organization and not some third-party vendor or outside risk assessor, but truly like the organization said, this is how we're ranking, this is the criteria. And so findings and vulnerabilities and risks that meet this criteria are going to be scored accordingly, right? So I don't know if that helps, but like that's where I see value in it. So.
Well, it's extreme value. I mean, that's part of what we all want. I think that the ability to use our expertise in ways that are not squandered because of squabbling or because of trying to fight a particular person's ability to be louder on something, that's a beautiful thing. That goes far beyond just taking care of the data and providing a useful thing, because you're actually then relieving stress on the practitioners and on the team, and that bodes well for everybody involved. So it might seem like a much smaller portion of what's going on, but I see a lot of big implications on being able to quantify and have an additional resource for prioritizing what takes precedence. And I forgot the next part of what I was going to ask, but I do think it's a big deal.
But I like where you're going, Mandy, and I think one thing, I don't know if you're asking this or this is my interpretation, but does the too many cooks in the kitchen only apply to human beings, or does it also apply to AI and machine learning? And then my brain went to like, in a machine learning algorithm, you're weighting those various measurements. If that's probably not the right term, I'm not an AI machine learning person, obviously, but if they're weighting the measurements there, if you're all sitting around at a table, the weighting is not. There could be a pecking order, but it doesn't matter. If someone brings up a really great point, that may carry more weight just in human nature, right? So I guess, Dan, my question to you is like, too many cooks in the kitchen, too many different types of measurements. How does that impact humans? How does that impact machine learning when we're talking about prioritizing remediation?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think that's kind of like some of the problem that we're trying to solve, right? Is
Mm,
that a lot of people have a lot of influence and a lot of opinions, and so today they may manually just go in and rate something really high just because they want it to be high, or like if you're developing a machine learning algorithm, you may actually put the criteria that you want to be influencing it, and then that may become a black box, so to speak. So like not everybody is understanding like how the algorithm's actually working. So like what we're providing is like, hey, you can set the criteria how you want it to, but everybody can see how that score is getting created, right? And everybody can see like, hey, you got a 72.9, and here's the way that was calculated.
mm.
So it's like the box is now, transparent, and and then from like kind of like too many cooks in the kitchen, it's trying to sift that out and just say like, hey, this is the standard, right? This is the standard for our organization, and not imposing a standard on a different organization, which is I think where some of these other scoring approaches have fallen short, is that they're trying to kind of blanket it to everybody, and that's just not realistic. That's not the world that we live in, right? Does that answer your question, or like, I mean, I want
Yeah,
to make
no,
sure.
because then my brain's going to like, we're using AI to enhance attack techniques, but we're also using AI to enhance prioritization. And so it's like we've got two competing systems. We could almost do a visualization or module where they just compete against each other. And then the result of that would be maybe stuff we actually need to fix. Who knows? We let the machines fight it out, but humans bring a completely different aspect, right? We kind of touched on that there's politics involved. I know this
Right.
project is a thorn in my side, and I want to see it killed. So therefore, any vulnerability related to that project, I'm going to give a higher severity ranking to highlight its problems, right? Like, and their biases in AI, don't get me wrong, but the human ones I think tend to manifest more quickly, and that could hurt you or that could help you. It depends on the situation.
Yeah, yeah, no, I think that's a good point. But and I think also on the AI and machine learning front, the nice aspects of where we're at today with AI is that it can take in large amounts of data and provide suggestions. Like I think we're dipping our toe in this is a different topic, but like in terms of like from our product, but we're dipping our toes in the water around AI. But it's from the notion of suggestions, right? Not like prescriptions, right? So a lot of and I'm not saying like AI should always be handled this way, but I think there's a lot of approach and fear around AI is just going to do things on my behalf, right? Or it's going to just tell me what to do, as opposed to like, hey, no, we're seeing like let the AI itself actually say like, hey, here's some trends that we're seeing. Here's some things that we're seeing based on the data. Would you agree? And then it even helps it learn, right? So being able to kind of train it as well, in addition to having it be prescriptive or be as prescriptive as you want it to be, is giving you some of that flexibility. But yeah, I mean, I think it's a fascinating topic for sure.
Yeah, Dan, how do we deal with the internal? I guess I want to go back to internal politics about, as we all know, we've worked for and with organizations and had to deal with politics over what should the severity be for this vulnerability and this, how should we prioritize the remediation? Oftentimes there's politics involved. How can like math and AI and these various factors help with that, right?
Yeah, and I think I think that those are all like we talk about like kind of like a risk register, or like hey, you're going to have an output. Like we've all agreed, like I'm just kind of talking in the context of our contextual scoring piece and our priorities module, but like, hey, we've all agreed that this is how we're going to, this is the algorithm that we're going to use in the scoring equation that we're going to use. We get all these vulnerabilities in, and then now we have our prioritized list of view of risks, but now we've got to decide, how do we resource those. It's funny because like as we've been building this, we see like an extreme amount of similarities in just software development in general, right?
Mm,
Like as a product team and as a product vendor, hey, we've got these features, we've got these requests, we've got these bugs, these this user request. How do we prioritize this based on the resources that we have? And so I think that's where it can help curb some of that political conversation of
Yeah.
like, look, you've got the top 5 priorities, but you've got 2 people that can work on those. So like you're going to have to like have them work on these things in this order while the rest of us go work on maybe items 5 through 10. So I mean, it just brings some sanity, I guess, to some of those arguments and conversations where you can actually just see it, right? And you're able to just work through the list. I mean, I think type A people love lists, right?
Yeah. But also
So,
seeing how you mentioned that you can see how the score was derived.
Yeah.
And I think that's important too, that there's data and there's science behind it. So when it comes up as, I don't think we should fix that. And it's like, well, here's how the score was derived. It's very much a provable thing. This was exploited. Now, we can maybe debate as to the criticality of the systems that it was exploited on. Sure. But like, there's no, it's hard to argue with remote code execution, right? It's hard to argue with someone doing that. So.
Yeah, exactly. And then it also helps clarify, like, okay, you've got RCE, you've got one that's on a public facing web server, and you've got one in a lab system buried, in a SCIF, right? So, so like,
yeah.
when obviously they're both important, but which one's more urgent, right? Probably the publicly facing one that and then go get this skip one fixed later. But that's kind of a rudimentary example. But by being able to see like this was the criteria that actually scored this, you have objectivity in terms of like, well, like I hear your argument, but this is how it's being rated, and you can see it just as well as anybody else. Where do we go from here? And I think it breeds healthy conversations around that.
When it comes to AI and threat intelligence feeds, what's your vision, Dan, for how we can take in external data and use it to help augment our remediation prioritization?
Yeah, this is where I'm excited, like where we're headed. And I mean, it's a little bit behind the curtain because we don't have this yet, but this is why we based the module.
I ask because you're probably talking about it now, right?
Yeah.
So as much you want to share publicly about what you guys are thinking about this.
Yeah, exactly. So I mean, like, but where we've always had a vision for AI, and then obviously we've always had, the notion of bringing threat intelligence into PlexTrac. Where I see the value is marrying the ability to take large amounts of data and be able to identify and correlate using AI the findings that might be related to the threat intelligence feeds. I kind of alluded to it earlier in the segment where you may get threat intelligence that comes in that doesn't have anything associated to any minor attack techniques, any known IOCs, any known exploit steps from before, but maybe in your data set within your list of vulnerabilities, and particularly like pen tests and purple team engagements, that those types of techniques have been executed in your environment. Using AI and language processing and all the above, you can now marry that and actually be able to say like, hey, no, this is valid. This is being exploited in your environment. We just don't have any way to correlate it outside of just the text and the procedures. So now,
I love this because you're like replacing me. Which I love. People get afraid, Dan, of technology that replaces them, but like I was a Unix administrator back in the day, and when I first saw like the sticker or the T-shirt that said I will replace you with a small shell script, I'm like, yeah, that's how I roll. Like I'm always looking to replace myself with technology so I can go work on more interesting things. And right now, I spend a lot of time going, wait, based on all this stuff I've just sifted through, all these feeds I've just sifted through, manually and visually inspecting this, I'm like, that could be a problem. Let me go research that a little more. And turns out, like a lot of these things, like you said, there's no CVE, there's no exploit, there's no, like nothing I can really tie it back to, but I'm like, this is something we should be concerned about. But what you're talking about is using AI to help do that for us, which is important.
Yeah, super important. And then also, being able to take that threat intelligence and say like, hey, you don't have any findings per se related to this, but also we've never seen you actually test for anything like this.
Mm,
So like you don't have any coverage to actually show, to actually bring any data points to validate or not. So you should go test this and maybe automatically, again, I'm kind of this, we don't have this today. I'm not saying we do,
yeah,
but
yeah,
this is
no,
our
that's fine.
being able to say like, hey, now go execute this test plan and this provides more test coverage, and then we'll be able to correlate whether or not you have issues related to it. And ideally it's even an automated scan, like we have integration partners, and so we can orchestrate those as well. So that's kind of like where we see the vision and the value, because like you said, it's not replacing the analyst, it's not replacing the engineer, it's freeing up their time to focus on the things that only their brains can do.
Yeah.
Right. And I think that's always how we need to, like, that's just, I guess, and now we're kind of getting on my personal opinion around the whole AI replacing, jobs and things like that. And I think technology has just always, helped make the automatable tasks more efficient. And so it gives the worker the ability to do the more complex things, and focus more time there. Right. So same with security testing and security engineering. It's like now your time is freed up from those other things, and so now you can actually focus on the much more complex problems.
Yeah. So I'll give you an example. Like I spend hours sifting through all the news feeds and all these different sources to find techniques, vulnerabilities, and what have you. And there was one that was as a web app pen tester, right? It was more of like a web app thing where you can get around a 403 unauthorized, right? Now, we've known there are ways around that. They are widely publicized. But what was new that I had to take time to discover was someone created a new tool, and I believe it was written in Go, which tells me like, oh, it's probably pretty fast, right? And it enumerates a bunch of those techniques and makes it easier for attackers to find ways around 403. I'm like, oh, like we should make sure that we run these tests in our environment and make sure we're not susceptible, even though they're not new techniques. Now there's this tool that makes it easier and it might be faster for people to find ways around that. We should work that into our processes and make sure we're resilient to it. So the human work is, how do I find this in my environment and remediate it, right? But the automated work, I could have gotten an alert. Let's just say we're in a future world, Dan, right? Paul gets an alert, right, that goes, hey, there's some new research, new tooling on 403 unauthorized, here are the details. You should recommend you go do this, and this, right? Saves me a ton of time, because really what I want to come down to is, well, how do I use this to my advantage, right? It's the discovery of that I think we can largely automate.
Yeah. And I think what's also important to note, and this is like, I mean, we know that AI is being used by attackers today, right? They're not limited by any kind of ethics boundaries or resource, like constraints, like, and so it is important to embrace AI to the point of like, how do we collectively help, use it to help us speed up as defenders and testers, speed up our processes and mechanisms, and these mundane tasks or whatnot. Because we know that it's giving a leg up on the attackers today and the threat actors. So how do we keep embracing it and figuring out ways to use it for our good? I think is really important, and that's some of the stuff that we're working on as well.
That's awesome. AI has become such a buzz. It's interesting how, like years ago, right, it was machine learning, right? And then I think many of us were quick to kind of poke at that and go, it's just a bunch of if statements. Now, it's gross, oversimplification of it. In some cases, it's probably true, right? But not all cases. Yeah. Then we came down to the, LLM thing, which is where we're at now, and how can that help us? And I think, to your point, Dan, I think we're on the same page. Like, it's an augmentation for people, right? It's not going to replace people. It's not going to replace your job. You still need people. And my whole take on this is always like, this is something that helps you do your job better. If I can automate portions of my job, my creativity goes to now what can I do that I've saved some time on there? Like what else how can I be more effective? And I think that's where tools that I think we're a long ways from like one computer model we're gonna wake up in the morning. I'm sure this is what you'd love to build, right? You wake up in the morning and it tells me exactly what I need to do to secure my network, right? And secure my systems. I think we're a long ways from it. I'm not saying it's impossible. We're a long ways from it. Until then, we've got tools that can help us get there, right? Help us do our jobs.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, we'd all love to be able to just have that, what was it, the Staples, the easy button, right?
Yeah.
Where you just hit that and then you're,
Yeah, I come in, the AI says I should do this, I push a button, it goes and does that, and then I'm free to go do whatever during the day. Like, no, we're not there yet.
Yeah.
There's still a lot of nuances to what we do in security. There's a lot of factors that I think it's super difficult for computer models to take that into account because it's so different in every environment. And there's we need to talk with people and make decisions, and I don't think that's going to be replaced anytime soon.
Yeah. Well, just being like, if you think about generative AI for a second, like just being able to navigate the prompts, like, so being, that takes a lot of human expertise to just say like, hey, give me something, in this context, like, like say it's trying to write you an exploit, like a payload, right? Like, hey, I need a.
First, it won't do that. If you ask ChatGPT, for example, as you probably have done as I have, right? And I don't want to ask it that stuff because I don't want to jeopardize my account because I've got some chats in there that so here's a secret. Like I'm trying to train ChatGPT to write articles in my voice. Right, I'm in this constant kind of iterative cycle, and I don't want to lose any of that training. But I also want to take, like, there's this vulnerability in some C code in something, let's say like shim for Linux systems, that I'm like, can you just go create an exploit for that? And I'm like, I don't know if I want to ask you that because you're going to ban my account. Right?
Yeah. This is the value of like a private model, right?
So not going to go to like Hack GPT or all these. I don't know if that one does it, but there's like all these other. Some of them are really shady. Some of them are just like a front end to Chat GPT. But yeah, again, this is a tool that can help us. It's not going to write blog posts for Paul at any given kind of clip, right? Like maybe some did, but still, I as Paul have to train it right now. Who knows? Maybe I should feed it like all 800 episodes of the pod, but then it would write like I talk on the podcast, which isn't how I write. So
yeah, exactly.
Maybe different.
Exactly. Yeah. So I think that my take on AI in cyber specifically is that I was part of the whole. I mean, I was a practitioner during the whole initial craze, maybe 10 years ago around AI and cyber. So I kind of feel like a lot of us maybe at that era are probably once bitten, twice shy around AI. But I really do think we're in a transformational period within cyber as well, and the AI. Like it's not as much snake oil as it felt back then, right?
No, agreed. Yeah.
Have to use this the right way. Yeah.
Agreed. Well, awesome. Well, Dan, thank you so much for coming back on Paul's Security Weekly. It was a great chat today.
Yeah, I thoroughly enjoyed it. I always enjoy it, and so thanks for having me. And if anybody is interested in PlexTrac and the priorities module and our contextual scoring service, look us up, plextrac.com. So. Yeah,
and let's see. Hold on. So I should have said this at the top, and there was just an operational error that we didn't in this segment. It was sponsored by. Is sponsored by PlexTrac, and you can learn more at securityweekly.com/PlexTrac. And Dan, I've been a huge fan of your product for some time, right? Like I know this is sponsored. Everyone's like, "Oh, Paul's just saying," because I'm like, no, like even before there were sponsors, like I don't know when we first met, but Dan explained to me what you guys were doing, and I'm like, that's awesome. I'm like, everyone, if you do pen test or have pen test, you should have this. This is great. Yeah. I think it was even a quote or something along those lines in your site for a while. So
yeah, definitely early on because they're like, oh, can we use?
No, I'm a huge fan, and I even think we had conversations where I was like, Dan, I think you should go into like more helping people prioritizing. It's like we'll get there. And when we met recently, you were like, yeah, that's where we're going. I'm like, that's awesome because. People need help with that. Knowing what to fix first is still an issue, and you're helping people with that. And it's awesome.
Yeah. No, it's our mission, and we're excited to be helping as any way that we can. So we're excited about it. Yeah, and no, thanks for your support as well. We've always loved working with you and being on the show. So.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Dan. With that, we'll take a short break and come back. We're going to do a little thing about DEF CON kids and talk about some news. Stay tuned.